In today's video, we'll be creating this particular effect. Of course, it's very similar to the background that we created for the light paths node demystification video. However, I never explained how I created that background loop. So in today's video, we'll take a dive into how we could create something similar, and we'll be using geometry nodes to do it. With that, let's actually begin the tutorial. In our default scene, we'll bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window, and change it from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor. Then we'll press this plus button to create a new geometry node tree, after which we'll zoom in, select the group input, and tap X to delete it. Now the entire aim is to have a bunch of curves that go from this side to that side, and as they move, they should be affected by noise according to the factor. So let's go ahead and add in a points node so that we can have multiple curves instead of just one. Now we need to control the number of points, which is going to be equal to the number of curves. So maybe I'll go with a value of 10 different points so that we'll have 10 curves created. Now to create the curve, we're actually going to instance on the points by searching for an instance on points node. And for the instance, let's use a curve line. Now remember, the curve line by default is going to be present on the Z axis, but we want it to go on the X axis. So we're going to have to change the start to a value of maybe -1, or you could have it even longer. So let's go with -5 meters. And the end value, we're going to change the Z value to a value of 0, and we're going to change the X to the positive value of the start, which is going to be 5 meters. Now that we have this line, we have to create more subdivisions, because right now there's just one point at the start for each of the curves and one point at the end. So we won't be able to deform it. So to create nice deformations, we need more points. So we're going to have to search for a resample curve node. But even if we resample the curve, we won't be able to actually use the geometry because they're instances. So before resampling, we have to go ahead and search for a realize instances node so that we get control over all of the individual points when we actually resample it. So let's increase the resample number to maybe 25, and the more this is going to be, the more chaotic the output will be as well. We'll start at 25 and I'll show you what the different values do in a while. Now let's press Shift A and search for a set position node, which is going to allow us to actually distort these lines. Now you can see for the offset, we're going to use a noise texture. And in fact, if you wanted to be looping, you could use a looping noise texture. You can create a custom node by checking this video over here. However, I will be updating that video to create a geometry node version as well really soon. So stay tuned for that video as well. Now we're going to take this color and plug it into the offset, but right off the bat, you can see that it moves towards the top right. That's because the noise texture is centered around a value of 0.5. We want it to be around 0. So let's search for a vector math node, plug that in right after the color, and change this from add to subtract. Now let's subtract a value of 0.5 on all the axes, and you should have it just displace along the axis itself. Now, if we were to scale up this noise texture by using another vector math node set to scale, by taking this and pressing Shift D and then plugging that in here and choosing scale, you can see that there's a lot of motion on the X axis as well, which doesn't actually look appropriate in our scene. So to remove any motion on the X axis, we can simply use another vector math node, and this time change it to multiply, and multiply the X value by a value of 0. And we can always keep this at maybe a value of 1 so that we have it distorting not just on the Z, but also on the Y, but not on the X. Now, of course, instead of a scale value, you could be playing around with these values itself. However, just being able to use one value is much more user-friendly in my opinion. Now there's another issue. This curve has to have no displacement towards its start and no displacement towards its end. The displacement has to increase only towards the center. So in order to get that, we have to scale it based on some spline parameters. So let's press Shift A and search for a spline parameter node, and you'll see that there's a factor output from this node. Now this factor is going to start from a value of 0 and end at a value of 1. We essentially want it to go from 0 to 1 in the middle and then 0 at the end. Now we can do that by searching for a map range node and then changing the range from 0 to 1 all the way to -1 to 1. So that way it's now going to start from a value of -1, 0, and then +1 over here. But then again, we want this to be 0, 1, 0. So the first thing that we can do is press Shift A and search for a math node and change it to absolute so that this becomes 1, 0, 1. So when we change it to absolute and plug this in, we now have this spline going from 1 all the way to 0 and then ending at 1 as well. Now if we just subtract a value of 1, we'll get 0 here, -1 here, and 0 at the end. So let's do that by just duplicating this math node, changing it to subtract, and subtract a value of 1 from this output over here. Now, if we take this and plug this into the scale, you'll see that we have no displacement here, some displacement over here, and no displacement over here again. Now we can take this and press Shift D to duplicate it, and now this is going to control the actual scale factor. Right now, this scale value is actually moving in a linear fashion, and in case you want it to be more exponential, what you can do is duplicate this scale node again and take this value and plug that into this scale over here. So now the growth is actually going to be exponential. Once you're happy with that, you'll realize that we created 10 different points, as you can see over here, but all of them are moving with the exact same noise texture. So the easiest way that we can actually change the noise texture for each of these is by using an ID node. So let's search for an ID node and just plug that into the W of the noise texture. So we have to first change the noise texture from 3D to 4D, then take this ID and plug it into the W. So now each curve is going to have a different position in the noise texture, which causes each curve to behave randomly. However, I still wanted to have control over the W so that I can actually animate this. So to do that, I'll just search for another math node and I'll simply plug this in here and play around with this value. So that is what's going to allow me to animate the W of the noise texture. Now that we have all of that set, we can take a look at what happens when we change the actual resolution of the curves. So in this resample curve node, if we start increasing the count, you can see how the noise texture is still remaining at its own scale and we're getting many more ups and downs. On the other hand, if we start reducing the count, we get it much more blocky, and it's really up to what type of animation you're trying to create. So if you're trying to create something like an audio spectrum, maybe a high count is going to be good. But if you're trying to create some type of electricity, maybe a value of 25 itself was good enough. Now what we're going to do is actually convert this from curves to actual mesh that you can see even when you switch off overlays. So for that, we have to search for a curve to mesh node and then plug that in right here. And for the profile curve, you can use a curve circle. So press Shift A, search for a curve circle, and you can take this right in there, but we're going to have to reduce the radius to maybe something like 0.01, and the resolution can be fairly low to make this much faster. Let's go with the resolution of 8. Now there's one last thing that I'd like to do, and that is the fact that most of the times where I'm going to use this, I want this central region to not have any of these electric curves so that I can place some sort of object over there, or maybe the node like I did in the light nodes video. So in order to do that, we're actually going to change the curve radius of this down to 0 when it reaches that central region. So let's press Shift A and search for a set curve radius node, plug that in right here. And for the radius, we already have this value that's going from 1 to 0 to 1. So we can take this and plug that into the radius, and we're going to have it much thinner in the center. If you don't want it to just be thinner and you want it to be completely invisible, instead of using this, you could just use the factor and plug that through a color ramp. So let's remove that connection, press Shift A and search for a color ramp node, and then take this factor, plug it into the factor, and take this color and plug it into the radius of the set curve radius. Now let's go ahead and change this color ramp according to our needs. So let's add in 2 stops by pressing this plus button twice. Now let's take the position of this and make it maybe 0.7, take the position of this one and make it maybe 0.3, and now change the first socket to white and then have the middle 2 values as a complete black. So what this is going to do is essentially remap the 0 to 1 to something that goes from 1 to 0, remains at 0 towards the center, and then goes back to 1. So this is what you get. And I think that looks absolutely perfect for most of my applications. Now for the animation in this scenario, I'm just going to add in a driver for this add value, or I'm going to press Shift A and search for a scene time node and simply plug the frame into the value. So now when you play the animation, this is what you get. And I think this looks fairly good. And the best part is that if you have it this fast and moving this randomly, you don't even need to create a looping animation or a looping node for this noise texture, because it's going to look like it's looping either way because it's fairly random. Now the last thing that you need to do is deal with the materials and the background. So we're going to make very simple shaders for that. Let's search for a set material node, plug that in right here. Change our viewport shading to rendered, switch off our default light by pressing these buttons, or you can actually select it and press the delete button to remove it. Then we'll change the world background all the way to black, and with the cube selected, we'll go to the material properties here and simply go down to the emission and change the emission to a nice bright color and increase the strength to a high amount. Maybe we'll go with 25, and to actually apply this material to the object, select it from this set material node. Now to make this even better, we can apply some bloom. So let's go to the render properties, switch on bloom, and you can actually reduce the intensity to maybe 0.01, and then you can increase the actual strength of the emission in the material properties. Then you can place your camera by selecting the camera, pressing Alt G to clear location, Alt R to clear rotation. RX90 will rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. GY will just move it back, and you can press 0 to go into your camera view. And if you want to add in some background, you can press Shift A and search for a plane, followed by RX90, followed by GY to just move it behind our object. We can scale it up, and if you want to see the plane, you can just switch on overlays for the time being. We'll make it such that it's larger than the camera view. Then we'll add in a new material. We'll go down to the metallic value and make it all the way to 1. We'll reduce the roughness so that there are nice reflections. And to actually see the reflections, we'll go to our render properties and switch on screen space reflections as well. If you want to get fancier with this, you can actually go ahead and press Shift A and search for an empty plane axis, and take this plane and press Tab to go into edit mode, Control Alt to add in loop cuts, and just add in maybe 100 loop cuts by bringing your cursor to one of these edges and then pressing 100 and then double tapping enter. Then again in object mode, you can go to your modifier panel, add in a simple deform modifier, and for the actual origin, we're going to choose that empty that we just created. Then for the bend, we're going to choose the axis as the x-axis, and we're going to reduce the angle to give it some negative curvature. Now back in our camera view with the viewport shading at rendered, you can see how we get a little bit more reflections. You can always move this plane around to just play around with the way the reflections look. Again, playing around with the bend angle will change the reflections that you get. And if you want to prevent this type of choppy reflections, you can go to object and choose shade smooth. Apart from that, if you want to get even fancier, you can go ahead and give this material some texture by going to the shader editor, pressing period on your numpad to centralize the nodes, pressing Shift A to search for a Voronoi texture maybe, and maybe we can just use a color ramp node to have more control. I'll plug the distance into the factor. I'll change this from Euclidean to Chebyshev so that we get square values, and take this color and plug that into the roughness. Now I'll play around with the scale, and I'll reduce the randomness down to 0, and I'll just bring these in and just play around with the scale until you get something that suits your scene. So I think this looks pretty good. Finally, if you want some objects to actually be emitting these rays, you can just add in some UV spheres. Let's go ahead and scale it down to maybe 0.1, GX to move it right over there, and then Alt D to create a linked duplicate, followed by X, and then just move it all the way to this edge, and then I'll go and add a material for it as well. Or instead of adding a material, I'll just choose the same material as my electric arcs. And with that, you can go ahead and press render animation. I hope this was a useful one for all of you. And if you actually watched till the end, thank you so much for watching. It generally helps with the algorithm as well to help others view more of my content. I post videos every single day, and I have over 300 tutorials on my channel. So definitely check them out, because I'm sure there's something or the other just waiting to be discovered by you. Until my next video comes out tomorrow, thank you so much for watching. Keep creating, and don't forget to stay creative.